Hi everyone, my name is Alex Ocanius, and this will be the first time that I'm seeing you in a way, first time definitely that you're seeing me in person at least. So hello, I work as the conservation social scientist with Dr. James at the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens, and this is my first year on the team. So I'm super excited about that, and I am also so excited that that gives me the opportunity to work with you all. I can tell already just based on some of our Facebook or WhatsApp conversations that you all are so knowledgeable, have so much insight and experience to share with us as well. So I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to share and learn with each other and hopefully all come out of this process with a much greater understanding of social science and how it can contribute to conservation solutions. I know also that Dr. James gave me an introduction during session 1, and so I think you're pretty much up to date. Really briefly, I had my first background in conservation was on the biological side of things, primarily prairie grassland restoration is where I was working at first. And then slowly, really without my knowing at first, I started to shift over to the social aspects of conservation. And I eventually pursued a master's degree in that field, what we might call the human dimensions of conservation. So more so the social side. And I've really quite enjoyed it so far. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things that I've learned with you all as well. So what we'll be doing today is session 3, and that is a follow-up to session 2, which was the first part of research design or of organizing your research. Give me 1 second here, and I can go ahead and share my screen with you, and we can get started on that. Okay. And I should also say that I, of course, would love to meet with you all in person. Obviously, that's not possible. I would at least like to see your faces on Zoom to get to know you a bit, but that's not possible either. So for the time being, I'm at least so thankful to be able to interact with you over Facebook. And who knows, maybe one day we might cross paths and maybe even work on a project together. So welcome to session 3. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I know that yesterday in session 2, not yesterday, a few days ago, Dr. James spoke to you guys about organizing your research, specifically how do you improve your question, how do you refine it, how do you create a hypothesis, and then how do you understand your variables and how they relate to each other. And then I think he also went over the different types of techniques essentially to measure social data, things like focus groups or using art, for example. Today, though, we're going to be focusing on other sides of organizing research. So it's going to be mostly a broad overview, and I hope you'll see why that's helpful. We're just going to go through the various stages. And I think at this time, during the course, you'll start to hear some repetition or things that you've heard already, and that's okay. That is intentional. We do realize that for some of you, this may be the first time that you're hearing some of these concepts, or you might just not be super familiar with them. So there will be some repetition in ideas and themes and concepts and questions, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and also to make sure that we're very familiar with those aspects and how they all fit together and where they come up in the process. And then, of course, there's also going to be content that we know most of you are familiar with, just basic parts of doing science in general. And we're still, again, just going to review those just to make sure that we're all caught up on the same page. So today in session 3, we're going to start with a basic overview of the ethics of social research before we then get into the bigger overview of the different stages and important concepts of the research design. So what are ethics? What does that mean exactly? If we take just a basic dictionary definition of that, it means conforming to the standards of conduct of a given profession or group. So in the social research community, that just means that we have a basic general agreement about what is okay and what's not okay for us to do as researchers. And this is really important because we work with other humans, other beings, right? So it needs to be clear what's okay and how we handle that, how we handle those participants. So there's some central ethical ideas here. The first being that the participation of our human subjects must be voluntary. So they need to be willing to participate. And this is because, for one reason, often the research that we do disrupts their life in some way. So even if it's just asking them to take a 5-minute survey, we're still asking for some of their time. So they need to be agreeable and volunteer to do that. We can't force them to take the survey. Also, sometimes we might be asking about personal information or things that participant wouldn't really want to share. They wouldn't be comfortable sharing with a stranger maybe. So it just needs to be clear. They might not know this, so it needs to be clear to the participants that their participation is voluntary, so they don't feel compelled or forced to participate or pressured to participate. And of course, there are some exceptions here. And this is where ethics can get kind of hard. It's not always exactly written out in very clear rules because it depends on your research. So imagine if, for example, you're doing an observational study on how people recycle when a recycling bin is presented to them. It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be possible. It would totally ruin your research if you went up to every person before they reached the recycling bin and asked them if it was okay if you observed them. So that's one case where their participation, you can't have it be voluntary. You're just a passive observer in a public space. So in that case, it would be justified to go around this ethical standard. But again, since these standards are throughout the community, you always want to bring your ideas and your methods to other researchers and have a conversation about, is this okay? Does it meet the ethical standards? If not, why? Is it okay? What could I do differently? Things like that. So there will be some exceptions. The other super important ethical standard here is that we should not cause harm to our participants. And this one's pretty set in stone. There are not really exceptions to this, not great exceptions at least. So again, people sometimes are sharing sensitive or personal information, and how this information is handled is really important. So imagine you're doing research about illegal hunting. A participant might agree to give you some data or to give you some information, but they definitely would not want their name getting out to the public if they participate in illegal hunting. They wouldn't want their address getting out. That could come back and could actually be harmful to them. So we need to be safe about how we handle that information. In other cases, it might be more subtle. Maybe we are asking them to tell us about stories or experiences that are or were traumatic, or things that they don't want to relive or bring back up into their mind. So that could actually be harmful, just the act of asking somebody, tell me about a time when you were traumatized, things like that. So just to be aware of. Also, let's say you wanted to do an experiment involving wildlife. It could absolutely not have the potential that your participants could be harmed with an interaction with wildlife. So these ethics, and especially these two together, when we ensure them, we typically use a process called informed consent. So this just means that we are informing our participants of what to expect in the research study, and we are also seeking their consent. So again, that it's voluntary that they participate. And often, there will be some sort of independent entity or institution that reviews your research plan, specifically the parts of it that relate to how you'll be interacting with your participants and how you'll be interacting with the data that they provide. This independent entity will review your plan, looking at the ethics of it and decide if it's okay, and if it's not okay, what needs to be changed about it. And they might even offer you some suggestions. One great big example of this is what we call an institutional review board. So they are essential. If you want to do social research, you need to have somebody sign off that what you're doing is okay. So I'm going to, before I get to that, I'm going to show you some examples of kind of what these informed consent forms look like. But before we get there, I'm going to go over a few other concepts here. So when we collect data from people, it's often data about themselves. And that means that there are different levels of privacy that we need to consider related to this idea of ethics, and especially this part about causing no harm to participants. So we can have anonymous participants, and this is when neither the researcher nor the people reading the results can identify or connect one response with one participant. So we have no idea who the respondents are. They cannot be traced. This would be really important in your survey with the legal hunters. This would mean that you don't even get to interact with them. You don't see their name or their identity or anything. You just receive the data, and their identity is anonymous. Not as extreme as anonymous respondents or anonymous responses is confidential respondents or confidential responses. This just means that you, as the researcher, can identify a given respondent's data and connect that, but the public won't be able to. So behind the scenes, you know, but that information doesn't reach the public. And there may even be cases when you want to keep your data confidential on the inside, on the side of interpretation. It's possible that knowing the respondent's identity could actually influence your interpretation of the results, if that makes sense. You might have biases, so maybe you don't want to know who gave you that answer, whether they're a male or a female, whether they, maybe it's someone you know, or maybe it's someone associated with an organization. You can take out all of that identifying information so it doesn't cause bias in your analysis. The other thing to think about here is deception. So as a researcher, how do you handle your own identity as you present it to your research participants? Of course, you want to be honest about the intent or the purpose of your research, but in some cases, revealing this intention could negatively influence the responses that participants give you. So let's go back to that example of illegal hunting. Let's say you're researching illegal hunting and you work for the government and you approach a respondent. They might not want to give you true or accurate responses. They might be scared about what you as a government official will do with that information. So, but you still need the information, and hopefully you have no intentions of harming that person based on their participation, right? So you want them to participate. I think the typical rule here is that in those cases where you still want to get accurate data, but revealing your whole purpose of the research could negatively influence the truth or the accuracy of the data that you receive, that it's okay to maybe leave some of that out at first when you introduce yourself or when you introduce the purpose. But after you've collected that data, then you would need to say and be honest about, this is what this data is going to be used for, and also assure that person that you're not going to cause them any harm, or that they don't need to be scared of you or what you're going to do with the data. And thinking back to this institutional review board, or that other entity that reviews your research plan, if you have something in your plan that has to do with researcher deception or how you present yourself to your respondents, if it's anything tricky, like the example we just mentioned, be sure to include that in your plan. Include your reasoning for that, how you're going to handle those conversations, and they'll actually have to sign off on that part of the plan as well. And then finally here we have honesty, just in general, and this is mainly how you handle your data, how you report the data. So a few things here: you want to be familiar with and honest about the limitations of your study. So you need to share these limitations with other people. Don't try to hide them. There's always limitations in science and studies in general. We just need to be upfront about them so that our readers or our audience can understand. And then along with that, you want to report your relevant findings, right? So if you have, for example, results that reject your hypothesis, or were results that you didn't want or weren't expecting, rather than hide those results, you still want to present them, even if they're negative results or negative findings. Even if you find no relationship at all, it's best to just put it all out there. That's the whole process of science in general. It's sometimes we have negative results. But if we hide them, then we can't ever improve on that process. And then finally, along with honesty, just of course in general as a researcher, you want to leave your ego aside, your personal wants or desires, your personal biases as well, and just come at it from an honest place, not with some personal aims or objectives that could influence your research in a negative way. So, like I mentioned before, I can give you some examples of informed consents. These are the things that your participants receive before they voluntarily agree to participate in the study. So this, I just pulled this from a study that I've done in the past. So this is a copy of a large paper form that my respondents received. It's a fairly formal document, and this one was quite long, and that has everything to do with the methods that I was using. So I was asking my participants to engage in an in-person interview that was up to an hour and a half long. That's a lot to ask of people. And so it needs to be really clear up front exactly what I'm asking of them and why, and what risks they might encounter by agreeing to participate in a pretty intense, maybe exhausting research experience. So you can see I have my contact information at the top, and of other researchers too, even instructions of how to make their way through this form, just to make sure that they get through every single part and that it's very clear to them. I gave a summary of the purpose of the research, and then this document really goes on. There's a lot more in here, for example, procedures, just so they know what to expect. I think in this section I also say I would like to audio record this conversation so I can use it for data analysis. Are you okay with that? If so, initial here. If not, initial here. So everything's very clear what they should expect from our interaction. There's, of course, sections about guaranteeing that confidentiality that we talked about. That's very important. People to keep their privacy. I, again, clarified that it was voluntary participation, and if at any time during that process they wanted to stop participating, that's totally fine. I discussed what the potential risks or discomforts were. In this case, it was possible that respondents maybe mentioned the names of other partners in a negative way. And so that was something that we wouldn't want to be traced back to them, because it could create poor relationships between the people that they were maybe criticizing. I have a section on payments to say, by the way, you're not getting paid for this. So again, here's what to expect. You're not going to get paid. You're not going to have any personal benefit, although this research will benefit this area in general. I have a section where they can contact us if they have questions, and they can even hold off on signing any form until they've had time to ask questions. And then finally, there's a statement of consent that they agree to. They sign their name at the bottom. So this is a super long informed consent. And again, that's because of the methods being used. But it can be much shorter and much more simple. So this is another one that I just pulled from a survey that I've done in the past. So here, it's basically just your research or your participation is voluntary, for one. You can withdraw at any time. It gives them an expectation of how long the survey will take. Gives my contact information. It tells them the responses will be confidential, and then ask for their informed consent. So much, much shorter, and that's because this was a shorter survey and it wasn't asking the same type of information. And it can be even more simple. So I pulled this from another survey that was much shorter. It hardly asked about personal information. The respondents were not asked for their names or any identifying information. So this informed consent is much shorter. It just says, your participation is voluntary, your answers are anonymous, here's my contact information, go. So I just want to show you the range of examples here that it essentially comes down to your research question, what questions you're asking of your participants. Your informed consent doesn't have to be 4 pages, but it might need to be depending on what you're asking them to do. So we're going to transition into this section about research design. And your research design, that's basically the plans and the procedures that you have for your entire research process. And coming up with this design involves a ton of decisions, some of them broad, some of the decisions very detailed, and you'll make those throughout the entire research design process. And basically we're answering 2 main questions. What exactly do you want to find out? And secondly, what is the best way to do it? And if you look there at the image at the bottom, on one side, it has this very clean representation of going from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, as if it were that simple. But I think we all know that it's really a mess. You're kind of going all over the place. You might get to stage 3 of research design and realize, actually, considering what I know now, or considering this plan, I'm going to go back and revise what I had initially planned for in stage 1. So it's kind of all over the place until you get to the very end and it's final. And it can be kind of messy, but that's okay. It's supposed to be like that. Let's see here. So, and again, when I go through the stages, it's going to look like that very clean image, just one after the other, but don't be confused by this. One last note here. at the end of the day, ultimately, your research design is going to depend on mainly 4 big things. One, the biggest one is, what is your research problem or question? Almost everything centers around that. 2, what are your personal experiences? 3, what's the audience for the study? And then 4, what's your access to resources to actually complete this research? So just at a glance, here are the different stages. So we start with finding your purpose. What actually do you want to research? What's the problem you're trying to address? And what's the question you're going to use, the big question you're going to use to do that? And I think you guys are you're at this stage right now. You've come up with your question. You've identified a local problem to target with it, right? And so that's where you are, and there's a lot more to go. And we're going to go over kind of what that looks like, what you should be asking yourself at each stage, and how each stage relates to those around it. So, right, you are here. Find your purpose. What do you want to find out? What's your question? You want to make sure that this is really a true problem. It's not just an assumed problem or something that you as an individual expect or think is a problem. And you also want to make sure that what you want to find out has some sort of social or conservation significance, right? That it contributes meaningfully. Along with that, you might want to ask yourself, why do you want to find out what you do? For example, do you want to maybe bring evidence to a local conservation organization to convince them that they should incorporate a certain type of learning experience into their program? Or maybe you're targeting a specific behavior. You're trying to understand why people are littering so you can encourage them to litter less. Another example of why would be, maybe a community leader has approached you and actually asked you to help them describe a local problem and help them come up with a solution. So this could be several reasons. And then after that, related to your purpose, you need to ask, well, what outcomes do I expect from this? It's going to relate to your why. So maybe your outcome is just a report to that local conservation organization, or maybe it's an article for a newspaper. Maybe you want to publish your research in a scientific journal, or sometimes maybe you just want enough evidence, enough data to convince the rest of your team that a larger research project would be necessary. But it would be helpful to have these outcomes in mind before you get started on your research design, on the research itself, so you can have those in mind and make sure that you'll be able to achieve those outcomes. Then your next step here, even in this first stage, is just to learn more about your purpose and really get to know your topic area so you can create the most appropriate research design. So you'll want to read about what other research has been done on your topic in the literature search or just a general background search. We'll get into this, some tips a little bit later. And then also just talking to professionals who might have knowledge on the subject or may refer you to more sources. So just to get a much better idea of what's going on. Of course, you probably have some sort of idea of what's happening, or else you wouldn't have been able to come up with your question in the first place, but there's always more to know. So what I'm going to try to do during this overview of the research design is take this initial idea, which is very, very simple, and try to transform it throughout the design process so we can see a bit how these different stages relate. So this initial idea is that I think people who have more experience with animals are more likely to support conservation. Again, very simple, but let's say this is what I want to research. So next here, in stage 2, we want to define the concepts that we're researching. So we need to specify what we mean when we use certain terms. So if we look here at my idea at the bottom, exactly what do I mean by experience? Could this be experience watching animals on TV, for example? Does experience viewing animals from a distance count as experience with animals? What about, does hunting count as experience with animals? Am I looking at good experiences, bad ones, both? So we need to define what we mean by experience. The same thing goes for these other terms. What do we mean by animals? Is that livestock, or is that dogs running around the neighborhood? Would it be just wildlife, just wild animals? And then of course the same for support conservation. What does it mean to support conservation? So again, another way to do this is to always refer back to the literature. So reading what other researchers have done. How did they define these concepts that they were studying? How did they measure these concepts? What questions were they asking? What suggestions do they have? So you can use their definitions of the concepts. You can reuse them, or you can adjust them so that they fit your purpose better. And then also, sometimes you're not going to be able to exactly define all of your concepts right in the beginning, but as you work your way through the process, things will become more clear. Or maybe it will take until you get your data back to really understand what you're studying. It depends on if that concept's already really well defined, or maybe you're doing a descriptive, explorative study to try to define that concept in the first place. But this is really important because the concepts that you're choosing to study, and how you specify those concepts or how you define them, is ultimately going to determine which research methods you use later on. So while you're defining your purpose and while you're defining your different concepts, and really throughout this entire process, you need to be doing a search of the literature. When I say literature, I mean mainly the scientific literature that's peer-reviewed, published in scientific journals, whereas the background search is more so just general information that's not in the form of a journal. So we know that research in general is just asking questions and looking for evidence to give some sort of an answer. And a literature search is essentially the same thing. We're just asking questions of what's out there and trying to find that information. And in general, it has 3 main purposes. So one is just to understand the current state of knowledge in this topic. It could be the case that what you want to research maybe has been researched exactly as you're asking it before. Maybe that question already exists, or maybe it's been done before, but not in the same context, not in the same geographical location as where you want to do it. But understanding what has been done before will, of course, help you come up with how you want to do it again, where you are and what parts you might need to change. Also, it gives you a head start on things like methods or theories, tools to use just based on what other people are sharing with you through the literature. Also, it's just typically helpful to identify some of the key authors or the key pieces that exist in your topic area. So I think, for example, some of you are interested in learning about collaboration. in this field of collaboration, there's definitely some key authors, there's some key theories, key ideas that you need to have a really pretty great understanding of before you even make your way into the other stages of the research design. Understanding these key parts of the topic will help you come up with the best questions. So you're not asking a question, for example, that just wouldn't make sense. And then third purpose is just to identify gaps in the research area. So what hasn't been done before, or what could be done better? Where can my research contribute? And ideally, you want to make your contribution relevant to the scientific community and to that topic area, so you can build upon what's there already. And in general, your review should be pretty thorough, pretty complete. To do that, in addition to finding those key authors or those key pieces, key ideas, try to get a good mix of different journals. Try to get a mix of sources across time, across different years. You might even want to get different methods used to test the same concept. You can see what worked well, what didn't work well, what did they learn there that I could apply here. So make it pretty mixed across the board. And in finding that mixture, you also want to find diverse sources. So basically, anything you can get your hands on in these initial phases is helpful to learn more about the topic, so you can create a really great question, great plan. That could be journals, as we talked about, books, articles, existing data that's just out there in the world, or a lot of times I think NGOs or nonprofits will release their reports, and a lot of times those have really good data or insight in them as well. So keep your eyes open. Also, though, be on the lookout for potential bias. You want to check the reliability of your sources. So ask yourself, is this trustworthy? For example, you might come across an article in the newspaper about a local conservation challenge, but ask yourself, can I trust this source? Is it presenting facts, or is it presenting strictly opinion? Because if it's opinion, that's okay, but just be aware of that. Excuse me. And then finally, in your background search too, you can speak, as you know, I'm sure, to other people, other experts, colleagues that can give you new information or point you in the direction of something that they think would be useful for the research. So really quickly, I'm going to bring us over to two sources, just some simple ones where I usually like to find my journal sources. For the other sources, like the NGO reports, for example, you can just do a basic search on Google, right? But for the journals, I go to Google and I go to Google Scholar. This has the scholarly or scientific journals as well as things like books. So let's say that I want to read about collaboration in natural resource management. And all these titles come up. Pretty straightforward. Just a few tricks here, maybe. So of course you can click on the article that you want to read. That's one very clear way. And let's see, that article comes up. I can read it, hopefully, if it loads. So while we're waiting, just a quick tip. I usually start with the abstract, read it just to make sure that it's even relevant at all to what I want to be studying. If the abstract is relevant and I decide I want to learn more, then I first scroll all the way down to the conclusion section, whereas that's where they present their new findings. So again, I can check, is this relevant to what I want to learn about or what I want to research. So you can see this piece came up. It looks kind of like it's copied from a book, that's great. So you can just click on the title. Another thing that I like to do is click here on related articles. So there might be stuff out there that I just wasn't aware of. I wasn't aware that I should be searching of it, but I can, or searching for it. I can click on related and see those other articles. You can also do a similar thing by clicking on cited by. That's the number of other journals that have cited or referenced that article. This isn't always as helpful, but again, it gives me some topics that are related in some way to collaboration. You can see some of the examples here. And sometimes we got lucky with that first one that we clicked on that it actually loaded. Sometimes they are stored on in databases that are not accessible to the public, where you have to pay an insanely high amount of money to get access to them. If that happens, you can sometimes try clicking on these other versions and see if you can find a free version. Unfortunately, there's no way around that, and that's just an unfortunate way that the scientific journal community works. You can come over here to the side. Like we mentioned, you want to have a diversity in years of where you take your data. So I can say search from 1990 to 2000, not 300, 2000, year 2000, or maybe I want the very most recent articles. So I can say 2015 to 2020, and it'll filter that for me. So this is the newest research on collaboration in natural resource management. There's one other journal finding tool that I can share with you that should give you free access as well. So it's called JSTOR, JSTOR.org. Take that in. And here's our other search bar. So let's say I want to research how much will people pay to a local conservation organization? Or how much will people pay to enter a national park? So this is what we call willingness to pay. Search that. And here these answers come up. Maybe I want to change that to in tourism. Okay, a lot of results here. You can scroll through, and if you find an article that you like, you can click on it here. You can just immediately download it. You will see that some of these you're not able to download, but for the most part, you're going to find some that you can have free access to. So those are two just basic tips. You're probably going to find a lot of articles that you don't have access to. It's frustrating. If you do encounter that and there's an article that you know that you absolutely must have, that it is so important to your research and to your learning, it is acceptable to find the lead author and find their contact information, an email, for example, and it is acceptable to send them an email and ask for permission, ask them to send you the article directly. Most researchers are going to be totally willing and excited to do this if you can get a hold of them. You don't want to do this for every single article because it could be overwhelming, but again, if you find one that you really want, I would say just go ahead and ask for it. So hopefully you're going to be reading a lot of different literature, a lot of different sources, and that means you're going to have a ton of information. So what do you do with all that? How do you keep track of it? I would recommend keeping track of it all, because even at the very end of after you've collected data, you're still going to be referring back to your literature when you try to analyze and interpret your data. It helps to look at what's been done in the past again, or what other theories exist. So I would keep it on hand and I would save it. You can just do that in a paper note form, of course. Just write notes about maybe the article title, the year, what you learned from that article. What I sometimes like to do is use Google Sheets. So it's kind of like Microsoft Excel. It's just a big table where you can organize things. You can see I have the author, the year, and then some of the main points. I put the author and the year, and I think I put the title too. You can't see it in this shot, but it would be in column A. And I put that information in case I want to find it again. I can search for those terms, the title and the author. And then here I have some main points from the article, just a very brief summary that I can look at whenever I'm ready. I don't have to read the whole article again. I like to put in at least one note about the methods that they used. So in this case, they used interviews. They say how many, where were they, whatever else is relevant there. And then some other main points about the major conclusions of that article, or what they found, especially conclusions that are relevant to what I would be studying. And then maybe even some questions about their research in general, or questions about how can I incorporate this to my research. It just depends, just basically notes. So again, really quickly here, if you're not familiar with Google Sheets, I'm going to just show it to you quickly. So Google, I just type in Google Sheets, comes up here. I think you have to have a Google account to log in. And then I can just create, by clicking on blank, a new sheet. Come in here and type my different categories. And it will save automatically. So you don't have to go and save it. Whenever I come back to my Google Sheets account, it will be down here and I can open it again. And I should also mention that with that JSTOR program, the one I showed you that has a lot of free articles, in order to use that site, in order to get those articles, you will also have to create an account. All you have to do is put in your email and create a password. You don't have to pay anything. So it's a pretty simple process, but you do have to do that before you can get access. Okay. Moving on. So again, in that literature search, don't forget the value of asking other people, experts or key informants, people who are on the ground and have firsthand knowledge. Ask them what they think, what they can offer to your plan. And then really, definitely try to emphasize from the very beginning local participation and stakeholder collaboration. So you're not the only person leading this research process, this endeavor. So this is beneficial for several reasons. One, these local people or other stakeholders involved in the topic area are going to have different knowledge than you. So just by talking to them, you will receive new knowledge, which will help you create a better research plan. It's probably going to improve your entire plan just to talk to these people from the very get-go, from the very beginning. And in that, they also have the opportunity to speak with you. So this two-way communication increases transparency, that we see you, we see what you're doing. They also, people that you involve will feel like they have some sort of a say in what's going on, they will have more buy-in or more support for what you're doing if they feel like they've had some sort of voice in what's going on and have the opportunity to contribute to the plan as well. So it's not just an outsider that comes in with their own idea and places it upon everyone else, but everyone else is involved in coming up with that idea before they participate in it. This is really important. Involving people like that really improves trust among everyone. And when you have greater sense of trust between researcher and respondents, or researcher and other stakeholders, or researcher and the public, whenever you have more trust between those entities, it's going to lead to not only a more successful research process and outcome, but just ultimately more successful conservation. So try to involve other people, local people and stakeholders from the very beginning, and whenever possible, whenever it makes sense, of course. Okay, so all of that was in stage 2 of the research design. So that was defining concepts. We spent a lot of time there just on literature review, because that is so key in the beginning stages, especially to see what else is going on here, and how is that going to influence and inform what I decide to do now. So again, these stages are all about making it really clear. What exactly are you going to study? So that first idea, that really simple idea that I had in the beginning, that people with more experience with animals are more likely to support conservation. Let's say by the end of stage 2 will be much more defined. So my question may have changed into, are people who have spent more time in their daily lives observing wildlife in natural settings more likely to support wildlife conservation? My question got a little better as I understood what I meant by these different concepts that I wanted to research, and I kind of defined them a little bit. And then hopefully I have a better idea as well about the different methods that have been used to research similar questions, different tools that have been used, different theories that I can lean on to come up with good questions for my survey. So hopefully a lot will have been refined or clarified or improved during these first 2 stages alone. So we can move on to stage 3. I'm not going to spend too much time here, because later on, coming up, we'll have entire sessions that are dedicated to quantitative and qualitative methods. So for now, we just need to know that these are really the 2 main methods. You have quantitative methods, which essentially just use numbers to explain relationships. And then you have your qualitative methods, which use verbal and nonverbal responses to explain the meaning of responses. So you can see that guy explaining with words how he felt about the free ice cream, not just using the numbers as the quantitative guy on the other side. Both totally have their strengths and weaknesses. It really depends on what question you're asking to decide which method to use. For the most part, typically the strongest research designs lean heavily on one side, but also incorporate some of the other methods. So let's say mostly quantitative with a little bit of qualitative is maybe the approach that I would take for my idea here. But so we're going to kind of zoom past this, but this is about where it fits into the research design phase. So, okay, once I have my question, what's the general method I'm going to use to get that answer? If I'm asking people to describe very personal experiences. Maybe I want to do qualitative, just very in-depth interviews, for example. But if I want to quantify, count the number of people or the percentage of people participating in coaching as a number, maybe I want to use more quantitative methods to describe that. So going past that, on to measurement techniques. So measurement is the process of observing and then recording the observations that are collected as a part of your research process. And the meaning of variables in a study is mostly determined by how they're measured. So we may choose to measure by, let's say, direct observation or in-person interviews, maybe a questionnaire, reviewing existing documents. There's different ways to measure the same thing. Unfortunately though, but also it's kind of exciting, it's very difficult to measure social factors. It's quite challenging. You can't see them for the most part. So I would say it's not as easy as measuring the height of a plant. You can't just start at the ground and end at the plant and there you have your answer. The plant is clearly 10 inches tall, whereas social factors often are invisible or they're even hard to define exactly in the first place. So to give you an example about something that's hard to define, if I'm trying to measure compassion as a social factor and compassion for wildlife, how do I begin to measure that? Especially when compassion might mean something totally different to my different respondents among themselves. It might mean something totally different to me. So it can be really difficult to actually capture that in an exact measurement. In general, we want to make sure that to help overcome that challenge, we make really careful, really purposeful measurements. We have to think really hard, how are we going to measure what we want to? And again, I'm going to throw this in again, that it's always important to learn more. When you get to this stage, refer back to your literature. You might have some stored up already. So you can see what measurement techniques have been used in the past. Were they successful? Did they have major shortcomings? Things like that. So let's take another example for measurement technique. Let's say we want to measure support for conservation. How do we do this? So one way to measure maybe could be to get a list of all the people that donated to a local conservation organization in the nearby city. And we mark these people as, yes, supportive of conservation. That could be one measurement technique. Or we could similarly get a list of local people who attended a meeting about a conservation project in their community and we mark them as supportive. Another way to measure. Typically, as we're doing in this course, we use a survey to measure. Even then though, let's say that do I ask people, do you support conservation, yes or no? Or do I ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you support conservation? That's quite a bit better than yes or no, but even still, a 4 to me on that scale might be very different than your 4. How do we know that we're measuring the same thing there? So all these different measurement techniques measure different definitions of support for conservation, and they're going to have different results. So that's why it's just important to think about this. How do we want to measure it? Be sure that we come up with the best way possible that gets at the concept we're really trying to measure. And I think one way that will be helpful to better understand this, especially for questionnaires, so that's mostly what we're doing, right, is surveys. part of the measurement technique for surveys is coming up with the wording that you use in your questions on those surveys. So to do that, I think it's helpful to think about variables, attributes, and then indicators to come up with a really good question that's useful and meaningful, purposeful in measurement. So you guys learned a lot about variables actually in session 2 before this. To review, a variable is just a grouping of the different attributes there. So this example, the variable gender has attributes female and male. Then the attributes is just the flip side of that. So it's the characteristics of a person or a thing. So again, the variable occupation will have the attributes farmer, lawyer, teacher, etc. This is important really because the relationships among the variable and their attributes help explain the social groups and the processes that we're trying to study. So let's say, for example, if we're studying the variable occupation of a certain group, we want to understand the breakdown of different occupations or different attributes will help describe what that population looks like. And then let's say we added the variable gender to our data, we can now also see how occupations vary, not just among the population, but among this other variable of gender. So between male and female, what is their distribution of occupation attributes look like? Let's see. In general, you want your attributes to be exhaustive or include all the possible options of the variable that they represent. So with gender, we have male and female. It has to have all of the options. If you've ever taken a survey, another example would be education level. They kind of have all of the options available. They have elementary, high school, college, graduate, PhD, all the options, because you don't want to leave anything off or leave anyone out without the ability to give you their information. And the point of a variable is to see how it varies, right? So you want to be able to capture all of that variation. Of course, sometimes it's not going to be possible to list every single option. Like with occupation, you can't list every single one, but you would at least want to put maybe other with a blank spot where someone can enter that in. So you can see our example with measuring attitudes or frequency, we still include that scale of the most to the least. So, or least to the most. So we have no support to medium support to extreme support for conservation. We get that whole spectrum of measurement. So again, it's really hard to measure these, most of these social concepts. It's not really enough to just come up to somebody and simply say, do you support conservation as your question? Because again, that can mean something entirely different to different people. So we need to help define what support for conservation looks like before that question gets to them, to kind of break it down. And this is kind of related to stage 2 about defining concepts. We need to know how we define concepts before we decide how to measure the presence or the absence or the strength of that concept. So in general, concepts have properties with them, and usually these properties are clear. They come with the definition of the concept. So for example, a person with the flu, that's the concept, the flu. And then the properties would be high temperatures, that they feel nauseous, or they are throwing up, they don't feel well. Those are properties. So a doctor doesn't just ask someone if they have the flu, right? They don't just ask and take that as the final answer. They need to take the work to assess those symptoms or those properties to be sure that it's the flu and not something else. And the same goes for social concepts. We can't just ask if they support conservation. We need to assess the presence of those properties associated with the concept. So how do we break down a concept into something that's measurable to get at those properties? And in this case, we're doing it for a survey questionnaire. So the meaning of support conservation is going to be different among many different people. And some people might not have even thought about their response to this question until you're asking it to them. So rather than just ask them to come up with an opinion right there, you want to make it really clear. One way that we can do this is by using what we call indicators. And I understand if this breakdown is a bit confusing with all these terms. It's okay if you don't remember all of the terms or exactly how or what they mean, but the importance is the idea, the concept of the idea of breaking your concepts down into smaller parts that we call indicators. And these indicators indicate or tell us if that concept is present. So let's say for our dependent variable here, the support for conservation, that we break that down and we say, okay, a person that supports conservation will, one, believe that we should have more protected areas. They will agree with policies to reduce the use of our natural resources. And they would say that they're probably more supportive of conservation than the people around them. So these are ways that we could measure presence of a person who's supportive of conservation. In this case, as an example, I'm not saying that's the best way, but just to illustrate what those indicators would be. On the other hand, for the independent variable, the time spent viewing wildlife, again, we can't just ask, how much time do you spend viewing wildlife? We want to break that down. So we could ask in general, what's the frequency of you viewing wildlife? But maybe we want to measure it by the frequency of the trips that they've planned specifically to go view wildlife. Or maybe we want to measure by when you happen to encounter wildlife, maybe a bird flying past your window, how much time do you spend viewing it then? So different indicators that we have for what we're trying to measure. And I want to note one more thing here, especially with this idea of supporting conservation. We want to break that question down also to avoid responses that are driven by something called social desirability, which is just this almost innate, a natural desire to present what you think society desires of you. So whether they are totally aware of it or not, your respondents are going to be able to tell that supporting conservation is a desirable trait for the most part, or it's a good thing to do. And this kind of subconscious pressure to be perceived as doing the right thing could actually influence their response. So if you just gave them that question, do you support or not, they're going to be influenced to say, yes, I support it, maybe even more than they do, but that's that social desirability playing a factor into their responses. So we want to break it down to try to avoid that. And I'll tell you another way to help get around that in just a second. So here are the measurement techniques. For one, for a measurement technique, we decided that we wanted to use a survey, a questionnaire, let's say a paper questionnaire, or let's just leave it at, we want to use a survey as our measurement technique. Also, we've broken down our concepts into not only definitions of the properties, but also then the different variables, and within each variable, what are the indicators? So presence of these indicators tells us or indicates the presence of the concept that we're trying to measure. So you'll notice here on the second one, where it says, if you look back at this examples, we want to see, do our number 2 on indicators on dependent variable. We want to see, do they agree with policies? These are all positive indicators of support for conservation. What I did here is I changed one of these to a negative. So maybe on my survey, the statement is, I disagree with policies that attempt to reduce use of natural resources. And I ask people to agree or that they agree or disagree with that. This might not be, so the reason that we're flipping it to a negative statement is to, again, to reduce that social desirability factor. So we essentially present respondents with this negative option, and in a way we're saying this is okay to choose this option, or it's okay to disagree with the policy. We don't expect you to agree. I think if you present all positive statements of, I support conservation, I tell others that we should protect natural resources, I agree with policies, then your respondent is already going to kind of feel like those are the answers they should be giving. Maybe they think that you, as a conservationist, expect them to give those answers. So we want to kind of mix it up with negative and positive so they can give us their true responses. Okay, so on to sampling. This is the 5th stage. So this is basically, who are you going to study? And how can you be sure that these people that you study or that you involve as respondents are actually going to represent the group that you're interested in? And then also, how do you get these people to participate at all? So keep in mind that we're going to learn a lot about sampling later in this course, especially as it relates to quantitative or qualitative methods. In short, it's really just the process of selecting different units from a population of interest. So when I say units, I mean maybe your unit is individuals. So how do you select the individuals that will participate in your study? Or maybe your unit is household. Maybe you want to study at the household level. Ultimately, though, it's the process of selecting the units from a population of interest. And by studying just this sample of units, we can generalize our results back to the entire population. So it doesn't really make sense, or it's typically not possible to give a survey to every single person in the city. That would be a census, or in this diagram here, that'd be like counting every single marble in the big jar to determine the colors in the jar, whereas it would be much more practical to just take a sample. The little jar, just taking a sample will tell you what to expect for the colors in the big jar, right? So a sample is just a group of individuals or a group of elements that represent a certain larger population. So the population, to clarify, is just the group that we want to draw conclusions about. So maybe that's a community, maybe it's a certain city, maybe it's people who visit national parks. And then the sample is the group of people that you select to be in your study to represent that population. So let's imagine you want to make general statements or generalize your conclusions about a certain community which has, let's say, 3,000 people living there. So first you draw a fair sample from that population. You conduct your study just with those, just with that sample instead of surveying all 3,000 people. And if you've done it correctly, if your sample is representative, represents the diversity of the entire population, you can generalize your results back to the population. And this is useful because it's basically impossible to ever study the entire populations. But it's also difficult to get a great sample that you truly can generalize. Your samples need to be very purposeful or deliberate. You can't skip past this stage at all, really. It's super integral to making sure that your results are as reliable as they can be. So in general, a larger sample is pretty much always better because if it's too small, you really can't be sure that it accurately represents the makeup of the larger population. So if I go to a school of 500 students and I want to study their attitudes about conservation, I can't sample just 10 of them because that would not capture all the perspectives, all of the attitudes among all those 500 students. It wouldn't be representative of that whole population. So really quickly, just as a quick overview to start introducing you to these ideas, we're going to go over quickly probability and non-probability sampling, or you could say random and non-random sampling. Again, this is just a quick overview to get you introduced to this idea of sampling and the different methods of sampling. And we'll go into much more detail in future sessions. So you have what they call probability sampling or random sampling, which is a bit easier to remember. So random sampling is essentially a method of sampling. It's exactly what it sounds like. It uses some form of random selection. So what this means is that every item in your population has an equal chance of being included in that sample. So back to this example where we have 3,000 members living in one community. You may determine that in order to be statistically significant, your sample of that community needs to have 350 people so that you can say, yes, I can generalize. This is a true sample, a true representation of what the whole community would look like. So for a true random sample, it wouldn't be appropriate to just survey 350 friends. You can't just walk down your street and pick your neighbors and your family to complete the survey. That would be a biased sample. It also wouldn't be a true random sample if you approached the first 350 people that walked into a food market. Even though that feels random, you're just handing out surveys to whoever you encounter. It's not technically a true random sample. So to get a true random sample, remember everyone has to have an equal chance of being included or being selected to participate. So for your community of 3,000 people, you would have to, for example, this is one way, assign a number to every community member, 1 through 3,000. You put all those numbers in a hat, you draw out 350 numbers for your sample. And that's a true random sample. Anyone could have been picked out of that hat and you would have known that you had the entire population in there. Another way is perhaps maybe you don't want to study individuals, but you want to study at the household level. So perhaps you make a map of the community and you number every house that's there, every house you can see in that community. And then again, you use a random system to pick, let's say 350 households and select a respondent from each household. So this is quite a complicated process. I think you can imagine how difficult it would be to get a really truly random sample. You have to have a lot of information on the front end to even know what that population looks like and how are you going to choose randomly, truly randomly from that population. So the difference between random and non-random is that it's exactly what it sounds like. The non-random sampling does not involve random selection, at least not a true random selection. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the non-random samples aren't representative of the population, but it does mean that the non-random samples, you just can't depend on this probability theory. You can't say, I'm sure that I got an accurate sample of my population. Because with the random sampling, we actually know the probability that we've represented that population well, or we know the probability that we've represented the population accurately. So with the non-random sampling, in general, researchers consider it to be less accurate and less rigorous than the random sampling. But to be fair, or to be honest, in a lot of social researcher, there's just a lot of circumstances where it's not feasible to do that true random sampling, or it's not practical, or sometimes it's not sensible. It doesn't make sense with your methods, or it doesn't make sense with your research questions. So don't feel like one is right and one is wrong. And then when we get to the non-random sampling, or what they also call non-probability sampling, those methods kind of fall into two categories. So one is accidental non-random sampling. And this is when, for example, we just sample by asking for volunteers, or we sample by asking whoever's available to participate, kind of like that example of asking the first 300 people who pass through the market. But we don't have any evidence to make sure that that group is representative of the population that we're generalizing to. So sometimes that may be the approach that you have to take. And if that's the case, that's okay. It just needs to be recorded in your process that this is what I did, this is a potential limitation of this approach, or this is why this approach is making the most sense for me. The second type of the non-random sampling is purposive, or it has a purpose. So we would, for this purposive sampling, we would usually have a certain defined group or a target group that we're after. So for example, maybe we are interested in studying specifically mothers who are between the ages of 30 and 50 who visit national parks. So in that case, we would walk into that national park and we would target women and ask them if they're mothers and if they're between those ages to take our survey. So that's a very purposive approach to the non-random sampling. And typically this non-random sampling is associated with case study research or qualitative research, where we have a very specific instance or a specific phenomenon or a specific group that we're really interested in learning a lot more about as a target. So I can understand if these different methods are confusing at first, but do keep in mind that we will go over them in more detail later. And within each random and non-random, we'll review some different tools to do sampling within each of those larger techniques. So again, this sampling is essentially all about the people who are you going to include in your study, or who will you invite to include in your study, because they might not all agree, or they might not all be accessible. Okay, on to stage 6 here. Data collection and processing. We are almost towards the end of this overview. So this stage is essentially about how will you collect data and how are you going to store and organize that data. So again, your data collection comes back to the methods that you're using, qualitative or quantitative, and also the measurement techniques that you've decided on. So measurement technique being interviews, questionnaires, experiments, observation, things like that. But at this point, we decide what's the most effective way for us to collect that data. So if we've decided on a survey for our measurement technique, what's that going to look like? Are we going to mail that survey to respondents? Are we going to leave it on a table in the office and wait for people to come up and complete it, which I wouldn't recommend, but hey, that's one way to collect data. Are we going to email our survey to people? So how are we actually going to collect that data? Essentially, whatever measurement technique you choose, there's tons of different ways to actually implement it, to use it to collect data. Even with interviews, if you're doing in-person interviews, you might think, well, that's pretty simple. I just show up and do the in-person interview, but maybe I want to do it on the phone? Do I want to have one meeting place where people meet me? There's different questions to be asking about how are we actually going to collect this data? And then of course, how are you going to store your data once you have it? This is going to differ based on, am I doing paper surveys? Do I need to transfer my results into a computer? Am I doing electronic surveys? Do they automatically save on some electronic platforms? So just be asking yourselves these questions, and you want to figure this out before you start doing it, so you make sure that it's possible, make sure you have the resources for it, make sure that it makes the most sense for the population or the sample that you're working with. You might prefer to do a survey on the internet, but are you sure that your sample would be comfortable with that? Or would it be better to do an in-person survey, a paper survey, or a spoken survey? So for example, I'm thinking with my question here, so this is this idea that has kind of evolved throughout this process. Are people from this town who spend more time viewing wildlife more likely to support conservation? So I've chosen to use a survey as my measurement technique, but how am I going to use it to collect data? So this is not a format you'd want to use, but this is kind of just, these are my big questions that I'm asking in general. Because I've included, if you look at question number 5, that is an open-ended question. So instead of providing the responses or the options to my participants, I just ask them the question and I let them say whatever they want. So think about your experiences with wildlife. How do you think those experiences influence your support for wildlife protection? And for my data collection decision, I would say that I think people are more likely to give me an answer to this question if I'm asking them in person and I'm right there in front of them, versus if I give them a paper copy and I walk away from them. So for my data collection decision, I would say I'm going to give this survey in person. I'm going to approach people. I will ask them the question and I will write down their answers instead of giving them the questionnaire themselves. So that's an example of kind of what that decision process looks like. Okay, on to nearing the end here. promise, analysis and interpretation of your data. So this is what you've been waiting for. You've collected your data, you've stored it all in a safe way. Remember those ethical standards about handling our data safely so personal information does not get out. It's time to draw conclusions. So what does it all mean? What are you seeing in your data? How do you make sense of it? And how do you make sure that the conclusions you're making are correct? So ultimately, your conclusions should reflect, like it says, these original interests or the original ideas that started the research process in the first place. But also it's possible that you find unexpected results that you weren't even asking about, but some interesting things happen to come out of the data. So keep your eyes open for that to really play around with it, see what's coming out. And again, refer back to that literature. If you've kept notes on what you found in your literature search, now that you have your conclusions, go back to it and say, how does this compare to what other researchers have found? Or what ideas can I use from their research to help me ask appropriate questions of my data to come up with conclusions? So I find that other literature really inspirational for finding meaning in my own data that I've collected. And then again, speak with experts, speak with the people that you have involved since phase one, kind of let them know this is what I'm finding. And I think that this is especially important in social research because again, it's not as easy as measuring the height of that plant. We can't just see it right there in front of us. Even if we're doing quantitative studies and we have the numbers right there in front of us, because people see different things, and that's the whole problem with defining the concept, right? We all define it in a different way. So it would be helpful to have several sets of eyes, several people looking at your data to help with analysis and interpretation as well. And talk about your results with them. Say, what do you think about this? Is there a different way that I could analyze this? Is this conclusion making sense to you, or do you interpret it differently? And so that's the hard part about social science too, is that there's, I think, a bit more room for different interpretation with the data than there would be for biological data, in my opinion. Okay. So finally, this is application of your results. So you've gone through all that. You've found some conclusions. Now, how do you make your findings useful? And ideally, you would have thought about this back in stage one when you're thinking about what outcomes do you expect from this. You want those outcomes to be applied, to be useful, to be significant, especially to your audience, to the people receiving the results. So, and it can be useful in small to large ways. There's a lot of options here. You could just put your results in a report and share that with people in your field, share that with the community you worked with, or maybe you just share the results in some way with colleagues or people working in the same field. There's several ways to make your results useful or to apply them to something. And then also because at this point you've spent so much time involved in this research and learning about the topic, from the literature review to talking to experts to discussing different ways to interpret the data, to being out in the field interacting with your research subjects or participants. You have so much knowledge on what's going on here in terms of the social aspects. So you totally have the ability to make practical recommendations or say, based on what I've learned here, this is what I would suggest to wildlife managers based on the findings of this study. So you can put out suggestions, and they will be fairly, hopefully, credible coming from you, since you have so much experience and knowledge now in this one topic. And then along with that, you want to communicate why these findings are important. So what does it mean, essentially, is what you want to just tell people. This is important because blank. And then along with that, you can suggest some other research that might be done relevant to this topic, or could help us find out more, or help us improve, help us create more behavior change potentially. So there's a lot of ways to make your findings useful. So to review, the research design is just that set of decisions that you make about the topic that you're going to be studying. Which population you'll study, which methods you'll choose, and ultimately these two questions. What do you want to find out, and what's the best way to do it? Really the best way. And all these different stages that we've been over, they relate to each other. Hopefully you can see how defining your concepts influences your measurement techniques. It influences what questions you ask and how you ask them. Also, your measurement techniques relate to your data collection. So this is, as we talked about in the beginning, it's all overlapping, it's going back and forth. It needs to be fluid, it needs to all make sense with each other, and that's why we're always going back and forth and tweaking here and tweaking there so that it comes out the best that it could possibly be. And of course, ultimately, I think we've touched on this at every stage. It all comes back to the research question. So your research question, what you're trying to investigate, will be, will really dictate the decisions that you make at each of these stages. And that's exactly why this session 3 has been just a pretty broad overview of the various stages, because there's not one way to do this. There's not one way to do anything in any of these stages. There are so many ways to do all of these things. There's so many ways to define concepts, there's so many ways to measure, and there's no way that we could possibly cover them all. There's no way that we could tell you the best way to do it. So instead, you're presented with these different stages and things to be thinking about at each stage. So even just you can really take some time and be thoughtful, think about the different options. What are all of my options for data collection? There are many, and each one is going to have different strengths. Each one will have different weaknesses. And then you have to also consider your abilities and the resources that you have. And as you make those decisions, hopefully you're narrowing down to what's most appropriate and what's going to be the best method for you and the best method for your research question. And then of course you'll want to use some imagination when you're going through this process. Like I said, there are so many different ways. So play with them, think about them, but ultimately focus your perspective and your ideas closely around the purpose of your study. And then 2 final notes here. This research design process, and I think breaking it down into these different stages is really important, because 1, when you present your research findings to other people, you're also going to want to explain why you did things the way that you did. In a way, you need to prove to other people that your research methods and results are trustworthy, or that they're reliable. And in order to do that, you have to explain why the way that you extracted data makes the most sense. Why should we trust it? So if people ask, why did you choose surveys and not interviews? You need to have some sort of answer or reason prepared for that. Similarly, if they just ask in general, what were the limitations of the approach that you used? You want to have an answer for that too. So going through the different stages like this helps you weigh those different options, consider different options so you can pick the best, but also so you can explain why you picked that one, not a different approach, and why that was the most appropriate. The second reason is that on the front end, so it's important to explain your reasoning when you're done, of course, but in a lot of cases, it's important to explain your reasoning before you've even started. So you might be presenting your plan to a supervisor, maybe just to another colleague, maybe you're presenting your research design plan to a funding agency, and you're still going to have to explain why you're doing things the way that you're doing them. Why should we trust this process to produce reliable, valid results? So again, going through this research design process and making note of why you're doing what you're doing, why it's going to be the best, will help you present a convincing plan to other people to get a project off the ground in the first place, to convince them that it's worth it, right? So I think that's all that we have for session 3 today. I think other than just to emphasize that as you go through these stages, you want to take some mental notes, but also some physical notes so that you can put those plans, those presentations together to explain why you're doing what you're doing. And then not tomorrow, in a few days, in a week from now, probably, we will be moving on to session 4, which is more detail about selecting the actual data collection methods. So I'm going to go just a bit more in detail about the different types of social science methods. So focus groups, interviews, surveys, participatory action research. So a little bit more in depth there. I know that this workshop, you're creating a survey, so your method is kind of already set, but it's also important to understand how other methods work, what their weaknesses are and what their strengths are, so that when you're in your literature review phase and you're reviewing what other people have done, you can ask yourself, is this the best way to do this? Is this credible? What are the limitations of this approach, just so you can be aware of maybe what they missed or what they were able to capture with that special method. So it's just good to have an understanding of the other techniques. In session 4, we will also review kind of what's the best way to combine those big qualitative and big quantitative methods to come up with a comprehensive approach to data collection. And then, of course, how do you choose the best method for your research question? It shouldn't be too complex, and we'll review some other things that we've gone over before session 4 as well. But for now, I'm signing off. If there was anything in this presentation that was totally or even just a little bit unclear or confusing, please do let me or Dr. James know. You can do that on the Facebook group. You can start a discussion about something that didn't make sense, or you can start a discussion about something that you thought was interesting or that you have just more questions about. Or you can feel free to send me an email, send me a Facebook message with something that you'd like some more clarity on. Otherwise, I hope to see you soon, or at least to talk to you on that Facebook chat. So see you soon.